So I'd like to begin this morning by describing a hypothetical situation. So imagine yourself in a convenience store. And don't think of like a 7-Eleven or a corporate store like that. Imagine it's more of a mom and pop operation, a family-owned store where the owner usually works the register. You've actually become friendly with him over time since he's always there at the counter whenever you pop in. Well, on this one occasion, you've popped in to get a couple of items, and as you're walking to the back of the store, you notice a woman. She is thin, even a bit gaunt. Her clothes are a bit of a mess, maybe even dirty, and she has two small children with her, along with a baby in her arms. Now, she doesn't notice you, but as you're looking at her, she takes a canister of baby formula and pushes it deep into her purse. What would you do? You have a woman who seems to be poor and hungry. She looks like she might need that formula for her baby, but she's stealing. And it's not some big corporation she's stealing from. It's a man, a nice man who's simply trying to make a living. What would you do? This scenario was presented in one of my seminary classes last week. It was a class on Christian ethics. The instructor was highlighting for us how difficult moral decision-making can be sometimes. And just so that no one is confused by the terms I'm going to be using this morning, morality is essentially determining what is wrong and right, and then doing what is right. Ethics is the field that studies morality. And then if we take this a step further, Christian ethics tries to understand how we make appropriate moral decisions based upon our Christian values. But if I were to broaden that out a little bit, I would say it like this. For those of us who have come to understand God's love as revealed to us through Jesus Christ, what are we called to do in this world? And who are we called to be? And I know that sounds a little lofty, but it's actually a question we grapple with all the time. We apply our Christian understanding to situations we find ourselves in to try to figure out what to do. It can be a small thing, like whether or not to give somebody $1 when they ask for that and you're at the gas station. Or it can be as huge as how we as a church respond to major cultural shifts in our society. But let me give you a concrete example to show you what I'm talking about. So I have a classmate, his name is Rod. He runs a church in Los Angeles, California. Well, the state of California just passed a law to legalize marijuana use and sales. So one of Rod's members has gotten a license to sell marijuana. He currently only sells for medicinal purposes, but the member has told Rod that he would like to start selling marijuana for recreational use. Is that okay? He would also like to start using marijuana himself. Is that okay? It's absolutely legal in California to do that. But using this man's own words, am I sinning against God if I do that? It's complicated, right? So how do we go about figuring this stuff out? Well, there are sources that we rely on when it comes to ethical decision making, and for us Christians, the primary source is, of course, the Bible. We also have our religious traditions to consider. In our case, that would be our particular Lutheran perspective of God and the Bible. So if you consider these two things together, the entirety of the biblical witness and our Lutheran understanding of grace and mercy, together, they give us the foundation for ethical Christian living in this world. And that foundation is love your neighbor as yourself. And if that sounds a bit familiar to you, you might remember that 3 weeks ago I talked a lot about loving our neighbors as ourselves. And I'm not going to repeat what I said then, other than to remind you that this notion of love your neighbor as yourself is entirely through the Bible, front to back. It's in the law, it's in the prophets, it's in the Gospels, it's in the epistles. So we can absolutely look to specific passages to affirm this idea for us. For instance, at the beginning of the worship service, we heard some words from Paul in his letter to the Romans, but I'm going to say those words for you again. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are all summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And for another example, we don't have to look any farther than our reading from Isaiah this morning. It's an incredibly strong statement about the call to love our neighbors. Now, you may have gotten lost a little bit when LU read it a little earlier. That's because it's a little convoluted. The prophet Isaiah is speaking both for the people of Israel and for God, and he flips back and forth. But let me break it down a little bit for you. So it starts with the people of Israel speaking to God, and they are complaining. They've been fasting, which is their way of honoring God. Comparable to us today would be this worship service that we're honoring God by being here. So they've been honoring God with their fasting, but they feel like God hasn't paid any attention. God has ignored them. But God comes back to them with some very harsh words. He acknowledges their fasting, but then he accuses them of not living properly. Yes, they fast, but they live for their own interests, they oppress their workers, and they quarrel and fight with each other. And then God convicts them with these strong words. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? And when you see the naked, to cover them? That's pretty direct. What Isaiah is reminding us here is that yes, worship is good and proper and something we should do, but God also cares deeply for what we do outside of worship. And all those things that were mentioned, loosening the bonds of injustice, letting the oppressed go free, sharing our bread, clothing the naked, these are all ways to say the exact same thing. Love your neighbor as yourself. And you know what? This absolutely ties with our Lutheran tradition as well, because Martin Luther described what he considers to be the basis of all human sin. All sin can be summed up with one Latin phrase, and the Latin phrase is this, according to Martin Luther: incurvatus inse. That's kind of fun to say. I'm going to say it again. Incurvatus inse. Actually sounds a little more like pig Latin than Latin. Incurvatus inse. But incurvatus inse simply means curved in on one's self. For Luther, sin comes about when we focus on ourselves, when we curve in on ourselves. The proper Christian life is the opposite, to be curved outward, toward God, toward each other. Or to say it a different way, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. So if neighbor love is indeed the basis for ethical Christian living, then how do we apply that? Let's go back to that hypothetical situation that I started with. So we have this woman who is probably poor, probably hungry, and she is stealing, probably to feed her baby. So what do the scriptures say about this? Well, we could cite Exodus 20:15. It's very straightforward, just 4 words. You will not steal. Period. And if that's our guiding principle, then we would either tell the shop owner or we would call the cops on this woman. But when we look at the Bible, there's also many, many passages about the plight of the poor. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor." Our lesson from Isaiah today said we are to share our bread with the hungry. So what are we to do? Well, if we view this through the eyes of neighbor love, some things become apparent. Appropriate neighbor love would suggest that we should have some compassion and empathy for this woman, and therefore not want to see her arrested for shoplifting. But also, neighbor love for the shop owner would suggest that we don't want to see him stolen from. So some other options appear. We could speak to the woman quietly and ask her to put the formula back so she doesn't get in trouble. We could give the woman some money to pay for the formula. We could take the woman up to the counter and pay for the formula on her behalf at the counter. And there's probably many, many other options that you can think of. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that we live in a complicated, nuanced world. Things are not black and white. And if we use the Bible to provide hard and fast rules for our tricky ethical dilemmas, then we're missing the mark. A far better approach is to view our situations through what God has asked us to do. And that is to view it through the idea of love your neighbor as yourself. But as you may have picked up already, knowing even what to do when we're trying to love our neighbor can be tricky. Which leads to one more thing that I want to share with you, which I think has huge relevance for our community and our congregation and our country. The easiest way for me to explain that is to give you another concrete example from one of my classes. So I have another classmate. His name is Ben. He's from Seward, Alaska. And he mentioned in class a situation that was occurring right then at his church. So on the backside of their property, they have an entrance that goes down to the lower part of their building. It starts at ground level and goes down, and it's kind of sheltered on three sides as it goes down. Well, recently it was discovered that 3 people have taken to camping down there. Now, this is Alaska, so being out in the elements is difficult, if not dangerous. Also, Seward is not a large city, so they don't have a homeless shelter there. There's no obvious place for people like this to go. And lastly, the church has a preschool on site every day. So the new wrinkle I'm introducing here is that good-hearted, well-meaning Christians can look at the same situation, even using the lens of loving your neighbor as yourself, and come out on opposite sides of a situation. Some people at Ben's church feel that the appropriate neighbor love means loving those children at the preschool and protecting them at all costs. So the campers need to go. For others in the congregation, taking care of those homeless people is the appropriate neighbor love. Both sides coming at it from neighbor love, but a completely different opinion on what should be done. I would argue that this situation is exactly what's going on in our communities, our country, and yes, even in our congregation. Because even using neighbor love as our guide, we are divided on the major issues of our society. And you know the list: immigration, abortion, gay marriage, police shootings, and on and on and on. And the fact of the matter is, if you look around this sanctuary, when it comes to these various issues, there is somebody sitting here who thinks the exact opposite about this stuff than you do. So what do we do about that? Well, here's the good news for us as Christians. Even in our division, we have a common belief, a common faith that joins us together. We know that God loves us without fail, without end. And we know that the love that Jesus showed to us on the cross binds us to God for all eternity. And that means no matter how many times we might fall prey to this to this idea of curving in on ourselves. We can be forgiven, and we can try it over again, and we can try to get it right. So we have this common ground to build on. We can explore together ways that we can live curved outward, to try to be a blessing to the people around us, to truly love our neighbors as ourselves. So as we were thinking about the complexity of all these things that I've mentioned this morning, we had an idea, something we'd like to do in the coming year. We've decided to name the coming year the Year of the Neighbor. And given how complex this topic is, it seems good and right to spend some time intentionally working on it. Now, of course, we're already moving in that direction, right? We have our dialogue with our African American friends from the churches in Fort Worth. They're coming on Tuesday night. We have our ongoing dialogue with the Christians and Muslim, or the Muslims and Jews in our community, our interfaith dialogues. We would love to explore more of those kind of things, but maybe even more than that. Doesn't it sound healthy to be able to have open and honest conversations about how we each might be using neighbor love to form our opinions? Because, you see, if I can just understand which neighbors you are trying to love with your opinions, then we have a basis for reconciliation. We have a way to come together. I think if we were to do that over the coming months, it would foster incredible understanding among us. And I'm happy to tell you that we've got the first opportunity to do that. 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be leading a Bible study and a discussion at the 9:30 hour, the beginning part of this ongoing discussion. But to finish up this morning, I want to return to the words of Isaiah from our lesson. And we hear in that lesson that when we curve ourselves outward, we please God immensely. Here's how Isaiah described it. After speaking about sharing our bread and sheltering the homeless and clothing the naked, Isaiah says that if you do these things, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, "Here I am." How wonderful is that? We have a God that promises to be there when we look to help our neighbors. And we have a God that also promises to be there to heal us. To heal us when we attempt to work on the divisions among us. Right now we are crying for help, and God is saying to us, "Here I am." So in the coming months, my prayer is that we all indeed feel God's loving hand guiding us, leading us, healing us as we journey together through the year of the neighbor. Amen.